Hello and welcome to today's video. So as you can see, today we'll talk about methods of dieting, specifically in a sort of fat loss perspective really. So the word diet is derived from a Greek word. I'm going to attempt to pronounce it, so I'm really sorry if I butcher the word, but the word is dieta. So this means way of life. So the original meaning of diet is basically way of life. And in nutrition, it means more the sum of food that we consume. However, nowadays the meaning of the words change a little bit, and there's a little bit of a negative connotation to it. So now it means a period of time where we over-restrict ourselves in types of food or amount of food, or even worse, sometimes we cut food groups completely. So first, let's look at the hierarchy. So when it comes to dieting for fat loss, there are a few things that we want to focus on to ensure that we get the results. And on the image on the right, we can see a pyramid. So in this pyramid, basically the bottom is the most important thing, and as we go up, it's less important. So the number one thing that we want to focus on when it comes to dieting for fat loss is energy balance. So this is essentially the main thing that we talked about a couple of videos ago. Then comes macronutrient, micronutrient, timing of food, and finally supplements. Although energy balance is the most important thing when it comes to fat loss, it's not the only important thing. Macronutrients and micronutrients are very important for health, and they all play a key role in the fat loss success when it comes to adherence and enjoyment. So now let's look a bit at popular dieting methods and strategies. So I've listed a couple of methods to promote a calorie deficit. So number one is calorie tracking, very popular method at the moment. So one of the popular apps that most people use is called MyFitnessPal. You may have heard about it. Essentially what that is everything we eat, we input it in the app, and that app gives us the amount of calories that we're consuming. And at the end of the day, you can see the total amount of calories that we've had. And if you are in a deficit, in the long run, we can get some results, we can lose some fat. So is calorie tracking the right thing for you? This is something that we probably have to dive a bit deeper into, and I will do this through another video where I'll talk about the pros and cons and whether this is something that you want to try. Next is intermittent fasting, another very popular method at the moment, and this is more based on time restricted eating. A popular one is 16-8, where we fast for 16 hours and eat for 8 hours. Again, that could work for some people, but for others it might not work so well. The next two are low carbs and low fat. So those two are very similar in the sense that in both cases we cut down or restrict a certain food group. They're both very popular at the moment, and we probably have heard that carbs and fats have both been demonized in the industry. So whether you decide to go low carb, low fat, at the end of the day it all comes back to the energy balance. So one may work better than the other for certain people, and it all goes back to your preference and what works for you. There's loads of research that have showed that there's not significant difference between low carbs or low fat as long as we are in a calorie deficit. So essentially you do not have to go low carb or low fat for results. So moderate fat, moderate carbs can work as well, as long as the final goal is the energy balance. A bit of a simpler one is avoiding snacking, so essentially just having our main meals and avoiding eating in between. Mindful dieting, mindful eating is a very interesting one. So this is more about the mindset and how we approach eating. So it's not so much when or what we're eating, it's more so how we're eating. So it's more about being present, being more in touch with our hunger cues, how we're feeling, etc. And finally, flexible dieting. So flexible dieting is more of a graded approach where everything is allowed, but in moderation. So it's a graded approach because it can be a bit slower sometimes, but it's more of a long-term success that we're focusing on. So adherence is usually the main reason why diet fails. So often what happens is when people go on a diet, they tend to restrict or over-restrict, so go low carbs, low fat, and it's something that we can't sustain for very long if the enjoyment is not there. And research shows that about 80% of people regain their weight after 5 years. So now let's dive a bit deeper into flexible dieting and let's compare this to rigid dieting. So as you can see on the screen, rigid dieting sometimes is a bit more bland, you're a bit more strict, whereas flexible dieting you're allowed a wider variety of food. So a few points about each of them. So when it comes to rigid restraints, there's a lot more of an all or nothing approach to it. So that means we tend to either over restrict or as soon as we have one day that isn't quite in line with what we're trying to do, we tend to throw everything out the window, and then it's either, as the word says, all in or nothing. There's also more of a dichotomous thinking around food and dieting, which means there's that sort of good or bad, and that includes cheat meals, good days, good weeks or bad weeks. That comes with rigid dieting. We also tend to follow food rules such as low carbs, low fat, no eating past a certain time, etc. And also there's more of a control and specific dieting behavior that comes with rigid dieting. On the other hand, flexible restraints, as I mentioned, is more of a graded approach, so it's more of a long-term thing. We also allow a wider variety of food, which means nothing is out of bound as long as we still pay attention to our goal and it's in line with what we're trying to achieve. And also there's more of a balanced approach to daily intake. So now let's dive in a bit deeper into cheat meals and why it's a problem calling it so. So cheat meals, the word cheat itself has a bit of a negative connotation to it, which means basically when you call something a cheating means we're not allowed it. So that leads to more of a dichotomous thinking around food. This is good, this is bad, like I mentioned earlier. There's also increased likelihood of binge eating. So whenever we're not allowed something, we tend to want it even more. And let's say you've ordered too much food because you know that you're not allowed it the next day, we tend to go on a binge and that sitting. There's also increased risk of disordered eating and increased risk in food preoccupation. So if you tend to go for cheat meals, you might have noticed that sometimes, let's say it's a Tuesday, and all you can think about is Saturday night when you're going to have that pizza, and so for the whole week we just keep thinking about that Saturday night meal. So instead of calling a cheat meal, calling a social meal or untracked meal can be hugely beneficial, especially in terms of your psychology and your mindset. Allowing yourself to have that meal can be very beneficial. So now let's look at what a successful dieter looks like. So success in a diet essentially means someone doesn't regain the weight after 5 years. And as I mentioned earlier, 80% of people tend to regain that weight after 5 years. So successful dieters are usually avoid dichotomous thinking around food. So there's no good or bad food, it's all allowed in some sort of moderation. They also avoid eating to regulate mood, so less emotional eating, stress eating, for example. They have less negative body image, so more of a positive outlook on their body, and also less frequent disinhibited eating. And in general, they also perceive the benefits to outweigh the costs, so they always more of a positive outlook, really. So a few other things that successful dieter tends to do, for example, number one is physical activity. So they tend to be a lot more active, resistance training, which goes back to the importance of building muscles and gaining strength. Eat fewer takeaways generally, and also they're more consistent throughout the week. And that goes back to that sort of cheat meal mentality where if you're restricting during the week, you tend to overeat during the weekend. So usually a successful dieter tends to be more consistent. And also eat a higher volume of food. So this is where the food choices come into play. So higher volume, lower calories in general. Last two is they usually have a lower food variety and they weigh themselves regularly. So those last two aren't necessarily optimal for health. It just depends on the person. But the reason why they tend to have lower food variety is because of that routine. So they're used to those habits, to that behavior, and they keep repeating these because that's what works for them. And at the end, lastly, weighing themselves, again, that can be beneficial for many people. It's more about understanding how the weight fluctuation goes. And when it comes to tracking progress using scales, this is something that I'll talk about a bit more in the future. So if this sort of profile looks like something you want to achieve, please let me know. This is something I do professionally, so I help people diet successfully, making sure that it's done in the right way, and we make sure that we keep a good relationship with food and avoid any sort of stress on our psychology, mentally, when it comes to dieting, because I understand that this can be very mentally draining when it comes to fat loss journeys. So yeah, if this is of any interest to you, please get in touch. I'd be more than happy to discuss and help you with this. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely day. Take care.